in a galaxy where strength is measured by the glow of energy coursing through one's veins, where civilizations rise and fall based on their warriors' power levels, there exists a simple truth that every species has learned to accept. The weak serve, the strong rule, and humans are barely worth noticing. But sometimes, the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look like a threat. When 17-year-old Maya Chen steps off the transport ship onto Nexus Station with nothing but a worn backpack and calloused hands, the alien registration officer barely glances at her energy readings. 0. Completely powerless. Another human servant, destined for the maintenance levels or perhaps the kitchens if she's lucky. What they don't know is that Maya has spent her entire life learning something far more valuable than energy manipulation. She has mastered the art of violence in its purest form. Stripped of all supernatural enhancement, refined through pain and necessity, into something beautiful and terrible. In a universe obsessed with flashy displays of cosmic power, nobody pays attention to the girl who can kill in 300 different ways with her bare hands. And that's exactly how Maya likes it. Because when the greatest threat the galaxy has ever seen arrives at Nexus Station, when energy-based warriors find their powers useless against an enemy that feeds on their strength, they're going to discover that sometimes the most primitive methods are the most effective. Sometimes, the supposedly powerless girl is exactly what a dying galaxy needs. Welcome to the story of how a human teenager with no powers at all became the most feared being in the known universe. Maya Chen kept her eyes down as she walked through the gleaming corridors of Nexus Station. Just another unremarkable human among the thousands of aliens bustling through the galaxy's largest trading hub. The energy scanners embedded in every doorway hummed softly as beings passed through, their readings displayed on holographic panels for all to see. Powerful warriors blazed with numbers in the thousands. Merchants and civilians showed modest double digits, and Maya's scanner showed nothing at all. 0. Empty. Powerless. The Zephyrian guard at immigration processing hadn't even bothered to look up from his datapad when Maya's results came through. Another zero-class human, he'd muttered in his native clicking language to his partner. Sanitation duty, level 7. Next. Maya had nodded politely, accepted her temporary identification chip, and made her way deeper into the station. She moved with careful, measured steps, her worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To any observer, she was exactly what her reading suggested. A young human girl with no remarkable features, no special abilities, no reason for anyone to pay her any attention. Perfect. The truth was that Maya Chen was arguably the most dangerous person currently aboard Nexus Station. But that truth was hidden behind years of careful training in appearing completely harmless. She'd learned long ago that in a universe obsessed with energy readings and power levels, being overlooked was the greatest advantage possible. Nexus Station sprawled across 30 levels, each one dedicated to different purposes and different classes of beings. The upper levels housed the energy-gifted elite, where Corvani diplomats who could manipulate gravity itself rubbed shoulders with ethereal traders whose thoughts could reshape matter. The middle levels buzzed with commerce and standard residential areas for those with moderate abilities. And the lower levels, where Maya was headed, housed the powerless masses who kept the station running. She'd studied the station's layout obsessively during the 3-week journey from Earth. Every corridor, every ventilation shaft, every security checkpoint was mapped in her memory. More importantly, she'd identified 17 different ways to disable the station's power grid, 43 potential escape routes, and at least 67 locations where a small explosive device could cause maximum structural damage while minimizing civilian casualties. Not that she planned to use any of that information. She was here for a very specific purpose. As Maya descended to level 7, the polished metal walls gave way to duller, more functional surfaces. The air recyclers worked harder down here, fighting against the smell of industrial lubricants and alien body chemistry. Beings with low energy readings or no readings at all moved through these corridors with the resigned efficiency of workers who knew their place in the universal hierarchy. She found her assigned quarters in Block D, a tiny room with a single bed, a basic hygiene unit, and a small desk. The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, and for the first time since leaving Earth, Maya allowed herself to relax slightly. She set her backpack on the bed and began unpacking, with methodical precision. 3 changes of clothing, all deliberately chosen to be unremarkable. a small toolkit that would pass any casual inspection while containing items that could be repurposed into weapons. A data tablet loaded with entertainment files that also contained detailed intelligence on Nexus Station's security systems, staff rotations, and the personal habits of key personnel, and wrapped carefully in the bottom of the pack. A single item that would have caused considerable alarm if anyone had known its true nature. Maya held the object up to the light. To most observers, it would look like a simple metal pendant on a thin chain, perhaps a family heirloom or religious symbol, the kind of harmless personal item that even the most thorough security scan would ignore. In reality, it was a quantum-encrypted communications device, nearly undetectable and capable of reaching across half the galaxy. She fastened the chain around her neck, hiding the pendant beneath her shirt, and activated her data tablet. Time to begin Phase 1 of her mission. The tablet screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be a job application interface for station maintenance positions. Maya's fingers moved across the holographic keys with practiced ease, filling out forms and submitting requests. Anyone monitoring her network activity would see exactly what they expected: a newly arrived human trying to find work. In reality, each keystroke was part of a complex infiltration protocol. Her job applications were actually probing the station's internal networks, mapping security vulnerabilities and identifying key system access points. The process would take weeks to complete, but by the time she was finished, Maya would have complete digital access to every critical system on Nexus Station. A soft chime indicated an incoming message on her assigned communication channel. Maya opened it to find a work assignment. She was to report to Maintenance Chief Gorak in the morning for orientation and duty assignment. The message included a basic station map and her temporary access codes. Maya smiled slightly as she read through the assignment details. Gorak was a Thraxian, a species known for their rigid adherence to routine and their complete dismissal of beings they considered inferior. According to her intelligence files, he'd been running the station's maintenance operations for over a decade, treating his all-human workforce with the casual contempt typical of his species. He would barely register her existence, which was exactly what she needed. She spent the next several hours reviewing her mission parameters and studying the detailed files on her data tablet. Nexus Station wasn't just any trading hub. It was the primary staging point for military operations in this sector of the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of allied species came here to coordinate their defenses against the Devourers, an ancient enemy that had recently begun emerging from the galactic core. The Devourers were unlike any threat the galaxy had faced before. They didn't conquer worlds or establish empires. They simply consumed, draining the life force from entire star systems and leaving empty husks behind. Worse, they seemed to feed specifically on energy-based abilities, making the galaxy's most powerful warriors actually vulnerable to their attacks. Maya's mission was to position herself within Nexus Station's infrastructure and wait. Intelligence suggested that the Devourers were moving toward this sector, and when they arrived, the station's energy-gifted defenders would find themselves suddenly helpless. That's when Maya would be needed most, because while everyone else in the galaxy had forgotten the old ways of fighting, Earth had never stopped teaching them. Humans might be powerless in terms of energy manipulation, but they had spent millennia perfecting the art of violence through pure skill and determination. Maya represented the very best of that tradition. She'd been recruited at age 7 from the ruins of New Tokyo, one of hundreds of children identified as having the right combination of intelligence, physical capability, and psychological resilience. The next 10 years had been spent in training facilities scattered across Earth's remaining safe zones, learning everything from advanced hand-to-hand combat to quantum physics to psychological warfare. Maya could kill an opponent in over 300 documented ways using nothing but her hands and basic tools. She could hack military-grade security systems, forge identity documents, speak 17 different alien languages, and improvise explosives from common household materials. More importantly, she'd been trained to do all of this while maintaining the appearance of a harmless civilian. The training had been brutal, sometimes horrifying, but it had been necessary. Earth's leaders knew that humanity's survival might depend on having agents in place throughout the galaxy when the Devourers finally struck. Maya was one of 47 such agents, each embedded in different strategic locations, all waiting for the signal to act. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Maya quickly secured her data tablet, and checked the door's security display. A human woman stood in the corridor, middle-aged with tired eyes and worn clothing that marked her as another Level 7 resident. "Come in," Maya said, opening the door. The woman entered hesitantly, glancing around the small room. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said. "I live down the hall. Thought I'd stop by and introduce myself since we don't get many new humans in this section." Maya offered a small smile. "Maya Chen. Nice to meet you. You just arrived on the transport from Earth?" Sarah asked, settling into the room's single chair. "Yesterday. Still trying to get oriented." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "It's overwhelming at first. This place is huge, and the aliens." She shrugged. "Well, you'll learn to stay out of their way. Most of them barely acknowledge we exist anyway. Have you been here long?" 3 years. Came here with my husband looking for work after the factories on Earth started closing down. He's in waste processing on Level 6. I'm in food service on 5. Sarah's expression darkened slightly. "It's not much of a life, but it's steady work." Maya listened carefully, filing away information about station operations and human worker conditions. "What's the work like?" "I'm supposed to report to maintenance tomorrow." "Gorak's your supervisor?" Sarah asked. When Maya nodded, she grimaced. "Good luck with that. He's not the worst of them, but he doesn't exactly hide his opinion of humans. Keep your head down, do your work, and try not to attract attention. That's the key to surviving here." They talked for another hour, with Sarah providing invaluable information about daily life on the lower levels. Maya learned about work schedules, security procedures, and the informal social networks that connected the station's human workers. All information that would be useful when the time came to act. After Sarah left, Maya prepared for sleep with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. She secured her data tablet and checked her door's locking mechanism. She performed a series of stretching exercises designed to maintain flexibility in the cramped quarters. And she reviewed her cover identity one more time, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Tomorrow she would begin her role as a powerless maintenance worker, just another invisible human keeping the galaxy's greatest trading hub running. She would clean corridors, repair ventilation systems, and empty waste containers, while powerful aliens planned their defenses against the Devourers. But she would also be mapping every security weakness, identifying key targets, and positioning herself for the moment when the galaxy's energy-based civilization would suddenly find itself helpless against an enemy that fed on their greatest strengths. Maya Chen closed her eyes and let sleep take her, her hand resting unconsciously on the hidden pendant around her neck. Across the galaxy, ancient engines of destruction were stirring in the galactic core, preparing to sweep across star systems like a plague of darkness. And on Nexus Station, a supposedly powerless human girl dreamed of the 300 ways she could kill someone with her bare hands, each method catalogued and ready for use when the time came to remind the galaxy why humanity had never needed energy powers to be dangerous. The greatest war in galactic history was about to begin, and its outcome might very well depend on the species everyone else had forgotten how to fear. Maya's first morning on Nexus Station began before the artificial sunrise that marked the start of the day cycle. She'd woken automatically at 0500 hours. Her internal clock adjusted to station time during the journey from Earth. The corridors of Level 7 were quiet at this hour, with only the hum of life support systems and the distant vibration of massive engines keeping the station in orbit around the local star. She made her way to the maintenance sector, her footsteps echoing softly off the metal deck plates. The area buzzed with activity despite the early hour, with humans and a few other powerless species preparing equipment and reviewing work assignments. Maya observed everything with careful attention, noting the layout of tool storage areas, the security checkpoints, and the routine patterns of movement. Maintenance Chief Gorak stood at the center of the operation, his massive Thraxian frame towering over the assembled workers. His species resembled a cross between a rhinoceros and a lizard, with thick gray hide, a prominent horn jutting from his forehead, and small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried the deep, rumbling authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "New human," he growled in heavily accented standard, pointing one thick finger at Maya. "Chen, Maya. You work ventilation systems, level 4 through 7. Report to Senior Technician Valdez for orientation. Do not speak to station personnel above level 7 unless directly addressed. Do not enter restricted areas. Do not touch anything that glows. Questions? Maya shook her head politely. No questions, Chief Gorak. The Thraxian's small eyes studied her for a moment, then dismissed her with a grunt. Maya suppressed a small smile at how perfectly she'd played the role of a submissive human worker. Gorak's attention was already moving to other matters, exactly as she'd intended. Senior technician Carlos Valdez proved to be a pleasant surprise. A compact man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes. He'd been working on Nexus Station for over 8 years and had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of its systems. More importantly, he treated Maya with genuine respect from their first meeting. Ventilation work isn't glamorous, he explained as they walked through the service corridors that honeycombed the station's interior. But it's essential, and it gives you access to areas most people never see. You'll learn more about how this place really works than half the supervisors up on level 20. Maya nodded, genuinely interested in what he was telling her. How complex are the systems? More complex than you might think, Carlos replied, stopping at a junction where several large ducts converged. This station houses over 2 million beings from hundreds of different species. Each species has specific atmospheric requirements: temperature, humidity, gas composition, even gravitational fields in some sections. The environmental systems have to maintain all of those different conditions simultaneously while preventing contamination between sections. He opened an access panel and gestured for Maya to look inside. The space was filled with an intricate network of pipes, cables, and monitoring devices, all labeled with symbols she didn't recognize. This is just one small control node. There are thousands like it throughout the station. How do you keep track of it all? Maya asked, playing the role of an eager new worker, while mentally cataloging potential sabotage points. Experience, mostly. After a few years, you start to understand the patterns. Plus, we've got diagnostic systems that alert us to problems before they become critical. Carlos closed the panel and led her deeper into the service areas. The real challenge is dealing with the politics. Politics? Carlos glanced around to make sure they were alone, then lowered his voice. Different species have different ideas about how things should work. The Corvani want their sections kept at near freezing temperatures with thick, soupy atmosphere. The Ethereals prefer low pressure and high radiation levels. The Zephyrians need constant air circulation with specific chemical filters. He paused at another junction, checking readings on a handheld scanner. And they all think their needs should take priority. We get pressure from above to favor the species with higher energy ratings, which means the Corvani and Ethereals get the best environmental controls while species like us get whatever's left over. Maya filed this information away carefully. The station's environmental systems weren't just functional infrastructure. They were a complex web of political compromises that could potentially be exploited. If she needed to cause problems for specific species while leaving others unaffected, the atmospheric controls would be an ideal vector. They spent the next several hours touring Maya's assigned sections, with Carlos explaining the maintenance procedures for different types of equipment. Maya absorbed everything with apparent earnestness, asking appropriate questions and taking careful notes on her data tablet. In reality, she was building a comprehensive mental map of the station's vulnerabilities. The ventilation systems offered access to virtually every critical area, from the massive atmospheric processing plants on the lower levels to the delicate life support nodes serving the diplomatic quarters above. The network of service tunnels and access points created invisible highways through the station's most sensitive areas. Better yet, the work gave her legitimate reasons to be almost anywhere on the station. A maintenance worker with proper authorization could enter restricted areas without question, access computer terminals for diagnostic purposes, and move freely through sections that would normally be off-limits to someone of her supposed status. During their lunch break, Maya sat with Carlos and several other maintenance workers in a small cafeteria on level 6. The conversation was a mixture of work complaints and gossip about station personnel, but Maya listened carefully to every word. "Did you hear about the security alert yesterday?" asked Jenna, a young woman who worked on the water recycling systems. "Something about unusual energy readings near the docking bays. Probably another ethereal having a temper tantrum," replied Marcus, an older man responsible for artificial gravity systems. "Those things leak energy like a broken reactor when they get upset." Carlos shook his head. "No, this was different. I talked to one of the dock supervisors this morning. They picked up some kind of disturbance out in deep space, something that didn't match any known ship signatures. Maya kept her expression neutral, but internally her attention sharpened. What kind of disturbance? Long-range sensors detected something moving toward this sector, Carlos explained. Not ships, exactly, but something. Command's been running diagnostics all morning trying to figure out what it was. The group speculated for a few more minutes before the conversation moved on to other topics, but Maya had heard enough. If the station's long-range sensors were detecting anomalous contacts, it could mean the Devourers were closer than anyone had expected. She would need to accelerate her infiltration timeline. That afternoon, Carlos assigned Maya to perform routine maintenance on the atmospheric monitoring systems in the diplomatic sections. This gave her access to Level 15, where representatives from various galactic powers maintained their offices and conference facilities. The higher levels of the station were a marked contrast to the functional simplicity of the maintenance areas. Here, the corridors were wide and bright, decorated with artistic displays from dozens of different cultures. The air itself felt different, carefully conditioned to provide optimal comfort for energy-gifted beings. Maya moved through these areas with the careful invisibility that came from being exactly what everyone expected to see: a human maintenance worker. Beneath notice and consideration, she serviced atmospheric sensors, cleaned ventilation grills, and performed diagnostic checks while listening to fragments of conversation from the beings around her. The diplomatic quarter was buzzing with activity. Corvani military advisors huddled in urgent conferences with ethereal strategists. Zephyrian merchants updated their security protocols. Even species Maya didn't immediately recognize were clearly engaged in some kind of emergency planning. She was working on a sensor array near the main conference chamber when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. The deep space monitoring stations went silent 6 hours ago, a Corvani officer was saying in clipped, urgent tones. All of them. Something is out there, and it's moving fast. How fast? Replied an ethereal in the harmonious tones characteristic of their species. At their current rate of approach, they'll reach the outer system within 72 hours. We're ordering immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. Maya's hands continued their steady work on the sensor array, but her mind was racing. 72 hours. That was much sooner than anyone had anticipated. According to her mission briefing, the Devourers weren't expected to reach this sector for at least another month. She finished her work and moved to the next maintenance point, passing close enough to the conference chamber to hear more details. The conversation inside was conducted in multiple languages, but Maya's training allowed her to follow most of it. The situation was worse than the fragments she'd overheard suggested. The Devourers hadn't just reached the outer system. They'd apparently consumed 3 entire worlds in the neighboring sector within the past week. Worse, every attempt at communication with the affected systems had met with complete silence. Maya completed her assigned maintenance tasks and returned to Level 7 as the station's artificial evening began. She found Sarah Martinez waiting in her quarters, looking more worried than she had the previous night. "Have you heard anything about an evacuation?" Sarah asked without preamble. "Evacuation? Rumors are flying through the human quarters," Sarah explained. "Some of the upper-level workers are saying their supervisors have been talking about moving non-essential personnel off the station. The question is whether non-essential includes us." Maya considered her response carefully. Who would decide something like that? Station command, I suppose. But honestly, if something bad enough to require evacuation is coming, I doubt they'll waste transport space on maintenance workers. Sarah's voice carried the bitter resignation of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from those in power. After Sarah left, Maya activated her secure communication device for the first time since arriving on the station. The quantum-encrypted signal would reach Earth within hours, though any response would take considerably longer to arrive. Her message was brief and coded in a way that would appear completely innocent to any casual observer. To anyone monitoring her communications, it would look like a personal letter to family back on Earth, full of mundane details about her new job and living situation. In reality, every seemingly innocent phrase carried critical intelligence about the station's defenses, the positioning of military assets, and the timeline of the approaching threat. More importantly, the message included a request for immediate activation of her mission parameters. With the Devourers potentially arriving within days rather than weeks, there was no time for the gradual infiltration she'd originally planned. Maya would need to move quickly to position herself for maximum effectiveness when the crisis hit. She spent the rest of the evening reviewing the intelligence she'd gathered during her first day. The station's layout was more complex than her pre-mission briefings had suggested, but that complexity could work to her advantage. The environmental systems were vulnerable in ways that could be exploited with surgical precision. The diplomatic areas were well defended against conventional attacks but had significant blind spots that a maintenance worker could exploit. Most importantly, she'd confirmed that the station's leadership was already preparing for the worst-case scenario. When the Devourers arrived and the energy-based defenses failed, there would be a period of chaos and confusion. That would be Maya's opportunity to implement the real reason she'd been sent to Nexus Station. Because while everyone else was focused on evacuation plans and defensive strategies, Maya was preparing for something entirely different. She wasn't here to help defend the station or evacuate its population. Maya Chen was here to ensure that when Nexus Station fell to the Devourers, it would take as many of them with it as possible. And to do that, she would need to be ready to sacrifice everything, including the lives of everyone on the station who couldn't be saved. In the darkness of her small quarters, Maya began planning the most complex and devastating sabotage operation in human history. Because sometimes, the only way to win a war was to make sure the enemy paid such a terrible price for their victory that they would think twice before continuing their advance. The galaxy was about to learn why humanity had never needed energy powers to be the most dangerous species in the universe. Maya was deep in the ventilation shafts of level 12 when the first alarm sounded. She'd been installing what appeared to be routine sensor upgrades but were actually sophisticated monitoring devices that would give her real-time access to the station's internal communications network. The work required her to squeeze through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, following maintenance routes that no one had used in months. The alarm started as a low, pulsing tone that gradually increased in intensity. Maya recognized it immediately from her study of station protocols. Incoming threat detected. All personnel to emergency stations. She made her way quickly back to the nearest access point, emerging into a corridor filled with beings moving with urgent purpose but not quite panic. Not yet. She joined the flow of maintenance workers heading for their designated emergency positions, keeping her expression appropriately concerned while mentally reviewing the intelligence she'd gathered over the past 48 hours. The Devourers were ahead of schedule, but she'd managed to position her monitoring devices throughout the critical systems. More importantly, she'd identified the 17 key structural points where carefully placed explosives could turn Nexus Station into the galaxy's largest improvised weapon. The maintenance assembly area buzzed with nervous energy as Chief Gorak addressed his workers. The massive Thraxian's usual arrogance was notably absent, replaced by the grim efficiency of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Outer system monitoring stations have gone dark," he announced in his rumbling voice. Long-range sensors detect multiple contacts approaching at superluminal velocities. All civilian transports are being prepared for immediate evacuation. Essential personnel will remain to maintain station operations. A Zephyrian technician raised one of his forearms. "What defines essential personnel, Chief?" Gorak's small eyes swept across the assembled workers. "Anyone whose absence would compromise critical systems, environmental controls, artificial gravity, main power distribution, defensive systems. Everyone else will be assigned to evacuation transports as space becomes available." Maya noticed that he didn't mention how much space would be available, or in what priority order evacuations would proceed. She'd already seen the transport schedules through her infiltration of the station's computers. There were perhaps enough ships to evacuate 30% of the station's population, and those spaces would be reserved for energy-gifted personnel and essential specialists. The 2 million beings currently aboard Nexus Station, less than 600,000 would have any chance of escape. The rest would remain to face whatever was coming out of deep space. After the briefing, Maya returned to her quarters to find Sarah Martinez packing her few belongings with frantic efficiency. The older woman's hands shook as she folded clothing into a small travel bag. "They're calling for volunteer evacuees," Sarah explained without looking up. "Anyone willing to take emergency transport to the inner system colonies. No guarantees about where we'll end up, but at least we'll be away from here when whatever's coming arrives." Maya sat down on her bed, maintaining her cover persona of a confused and frightened young woman. "Are you going?" "I think so. My husband's already signed up for the next transport. Says we can find work anywhere, but we can't find work if we're dead." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "What about you?" "I don't know," Maya replied truthfully. "I just got here. Don't really have anywhere else to go." Sarah looked up at her with obvious sympathy. "You're young. You should take the opportunity to get out of here. From what I'm hearing, this isn't going to be like the usual pirate raids or territorial disputes. This is something worse." If only she knew, Maya thought. Aloud, she said, "Maybe you're right." After Sarah left to register for evacuation, Maya activated her secure communication device and found a message waiting for her. The quantum encrypted signal contained her final mission parameters, along with intelligence updates that made her blood run cold. The Devourers weren't just approaching Nexus Station. They'd apparently consumed every inhabited system between the galactic core and this sector. Dozens of worlds, billions of beings, entire civilizations wiped out, without leaving so much as a distress signal. The only evidence of their passage was the expanding sphere of dead space surrounding their points of origin. Worse, initial attempts at military resistance had failed catastrophically. A Corvani battle fleet, with enough firepower to level continents, had engaged the lead elements of the Devourer force near the Arcturus system. The engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes before all communication with the fleet ceased. Maya's mission parameters were equally chilling. She was to remain on Nexus Station and gather intelligence on Devourer capabilities by any means necessary. When the station's fall became inevitable, she was to detonate a series of improvised nuclear devices that would destroy the station and hopefully take a significant portion of the attacking force with it. The message concluded with a single line that made Maya's hands tremble slightly as she read it. "Earth's survival may depend on the intelligence you gather. Do not allow yourself to be taken alive." She deleted the message and began her final preparations. Over the next 12 hours, while evacuation transports departed the station at regular intervals, Maya moved through the maintenance areas with deadly purpose. She converted routine cleaning supplies into explosive compounds using knowledge gained from years of specialized training. She planted monitoring devices that would record everything that happened during the coming battle, and she positioned herself to gather the intelligence that Earth's military planners would need if they hoped to develop effective defenses against this new threat. The first direct visual contact came 18 hours after the initial alarm. Maya was in the observation deck of Level 22. Ostensibly performing routine maintenance on the external sensor arrays when the long-range cameras picked up the approaching fleet. Fleet was the wrong word. What approached Nexus Station wasn't a collection of ships in any recognizable sense. The Devourers moved through space as a writhing mass of organic-looking structures, each one the size of a small moon. They pulsed with dark energy that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it, creating shadows against the star field that hurt to look at directly. Worse, they moved in ways that violated every known principle of physics. No engine signatures, no evidence of propulsion systems, yet they accelerated and changed direction with impossible speed and precision. Watching them approach was like watching a nightmare given physical form. The station's defensive systems activated automatically as the contacts entered extreme weapons range. Nexus Station was protected by some of the most advanced military technology in the galaxy. Particle beam arrays that could vaporize asteroids, shield generators powered by miniature stars, missile systems guided by artificial intelligences sophisticated enough to qualify as independent life forms. Maya watched through the external cameras as the defensive grid opened fire. Streams of coherent energy that should have been bright enough to blind anyone looking directly at them seemed to disappear into the approaching mass without effect. Missiles that could track their targets across light years of space flew directly into the Devourer formation and vanished as if they had never existed. The shields designed to protect against planet-killer weapons flickered and died within seconds of contact with the dark energy radiating from the attacking force. It was as if the Devourers were somehow draining the power from every defensive system they encountered, turning the station's own strength against it. Maya's training had prepared her for many things, but watching the complete failure of technology she'd believed to be invincible was not among them. She forced herself to remain focused on her mission, documenting everything through her hidden recording devices, while fighting down the primal fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. The Devourers reached the station's outer docking ring 43 minutes after entering weapons range. Maya felt the massive structure shudder as the first contact was made, a vibration that seemed to come from within the station's very bones. Through her infiltrated computer network, She watched as power systems throughout the station began failing in sequence. But it wasn't random system failure. The Devourers were somehow targeting specific types of technology while leaving others untouched. Energy-based weapons and defenses went dark first, followed by shield generators and artificial gravity systems. Meanwhile, basic life support and mechanical systems continued to function normally. Maya realized with growing horror what was happening. The Devourers weren't destroying Nexus Station. They were harvesting it. The dark energy she'd seen wasn't some kind of exotic weapon. It was a feeding mechanism that drained the life force from energy-gifted beings while leaving the basic infrastructure intact for future use. Her understanding was confirmed when the first Devourer troops breached the station's hull. Maya watched through security cameras as creatures that defied easy description flowed through corridors like living shadows. They moved past frightened civilians without apparent interest. But whenever they encountered beings with significant energy readings, the results were horrifying. The Devourers would surround their target in a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to pull energy directly from their victim's body. Powerful Corvani warriors who could manipulate gravity itself died in seconds, their bodies withering as their life force was drained away. Ethereal diplomats whose thoughts could reshape matter found their abilities turned against them, their own energy being used to fuel their destruction. But humans and other powerless species were largely ignored. The Devourers seemed to recognize that there was no energy to harvest from them and moved on to more profitable targets. It was a massacre, but a selective one that followed a logical pattern. Maya used this knowledge to move freely through the station as chaos erupted around her. She made her way to the main computer core on level 18, where she could access the most detailed sensor data about the attacking force. If she was going to die here, she wanted to make sure the intelligence she gathered would give Earth's defenders every possible advantage. The computer core was defended by the station's most sophisticated security systems, but Maya's weeks of careful preparation had given her access to every system on the station. She slipped past automated defenses and into the central processing chamber, where massive quantum computers processed data from throughout the galaxy. What she found there changed everything she thought she understood about the Devourers. The sensor readings showed that the attacking creatures weren't just harvesting energy from their victims. They were converting it into something else, storing it in specialized organic structures that served as both weapons and food sources. More importantly, the process wasn't one way. Under certain conditions, the stored energy could be released back into the environment. Maya's mind raced as she analyzed the implications. The Devourers weren't unstoppable forces of nature. They were sophisticated energy parasites that had found a way to turn their victims' own power against them. But parasites could be countered if you understood their feeding mechanisms. She was downloading the complete sensor logs when proximity alarms throughout the computer core began screaming. Maya looked up to see darkness seeping through the sealed doors, flowing like liquid shadow toward the computer systems. For the first time since the attack began, Maya came face to face with a Devourer. The creature was impossible to describe in any terms that made sense. It existed in a state somewhere between energy and matter, constantly shifting and reforming itself as it moved. When it focused its attention on Maya, she felt a probing sensation in her mind, as if something alien was examining her thoughts. Then, remarkably, it lost interest. The creature flowed past her toward the computer systems, apparently concluding that she posed no threat and offered no energy worth harvesting. Maya remained perfectly still as the Devourer interfaced with the quantum computers, watching as it began extracting information in ways that bypassed every security protocol the station's designers had created. But while it was distracted by its data harvesting, Maya was able to complete her own mission. She finished downloading the sensor logs and activated the first phase of her sabotage protocol. Throughout the station, devices she'd planted during her weeks of preparation began releasing their deadly contents into the atmospheric systems. The Devourers might be immune to energy weapons, but they still needed to maintain physical coherence. And Maya had just introduced a cocktail of exotic chemicals into the station's air supply that would disrupt the molecular bonds holding their shape-shifting forms together. She slipped away from the computer core as the first effects of her sabotage became apparent. The Devourer creatures began losing cohesion, their flowing forms becoming unstable and dispersed. It wouldn't kill them, but it would buy her time to implement the final phase of her mission. Maya made her way through increasingly chaotic corridors toward the station's primary reactor core. Behind her, alarms screamed as the Devourers realized they were under attack from an enemy they hadn't anticipated. For the first time since their arrival, The invincible force that had consumed dozens of star systems found itself facing something they couldn't simply drain and devour. They were about to discover why humanity had never needed energy powers to be dangerous. Because sometimes, the most effective weapon was the one your enemy never saw coming. The chemical disruption spread through Nexus Station's atmospheric systems like a plague designed specifically for the Devourers. Maya watched through security feeds as the invading creatures began losing their fluid grace, their forms becoming erratic and unstable. What had been flowing shadows capable of impossible movement now struggled to maintain basic cohesion, but Maya's satisfaction was short-lived. Within minutes of the first effects becoming apparent, the Devourers began adapting. Their forms shifted, developing protective membranes that filtered the contaminated air. Some merged together into larger entities that seemed more resistant to the chemical attack. Others withdrew entirely to the areas of the station where atmospheric controls had been damaged, creating pocket environments free from Maya's sabotage. Worse, they were learning. Through her infiltrated network, Maya could see the creatures communicating in ways that bypassed conventional understanding. Information flowed between them at impossible speeds, and within an hour they had not only adapted to her chemical weapons but had begun actively hunting for their source. Maya realized with growing alarm that she had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed the Devourers were simply overwhelming force, unstoppable but ultimately mindless. The truth was far more terrifying. These creatures possessed intelligence that operated on principles completely alien to anything in galactic civilization. They learned, they adapted, and now they knew that somewhere on the station was an enemy, capable of harming them. The hunt began with subtle changes in their movement patterns. Instead of the seemingly random flow through corridors that had characterized their initial assault, the Devourers started moving with purpose toward specific areas. Maya watched them probe environmental control centers, examining atmospheric distribution systems and tracing the sources of contamination back through the station's infrastructure. She had perhaps 20 minutes before they tracked the chemical releases to her planted devices. After that, it would be a simple matter for creatures capable of interfacing directly with computer systems to trace the sabotage back to its source. Maya Chen, the powerless maintenance worker who should have been beneath their notice, would suddenly become their primary target. Maya made her decision with the cold calculation that had been drilled into her through years of training. She couldn't reach the reactor core in time to implement her nuclear option. The Devourers were adapting too quickly, learning too fast. Her mission parameters included a backup plan for exactly this scenario, but it was one she'd hoped never to use. She would have to become bait. Maya began moving through the station with deliberate purpose, no longer trying to avoid the Devourer forces but positioning herself to lead them into a carefully planned trap. She triggered emergency access protocols that opened sealed maintenance areas, creating a path through sections of the station that would funnel the pursuing creatures toward her chosen battleground. Because while the Devourers might be learning to counter her chemical weapons, they still underestimated what a human could accomplish with nothing but skill, determination, and carefully applied physics. Her destination was the station's primary artificial gravity generator, a massive installation buried deep in the station's core. The generator created the gravitational fields that allowed millions of beings to move normally through the station's structure, but it could also be modified in ways that would create localized gravitational anomalies capable of tearing apart even shape-shifting entities. Maya reached the gravity control center as proximity alarms throughout the station began indicating massive Devourer movement in her direction. The creatures had traced her sabotage to its source and were converging on her position with the focused intensity of a pack of predators who had finally identified their prey. The control center was a cathedral-like space filled with towering columns of exotic matter contained within magnetic bottles. These were the gravity generators themselves, each one capable of creating gravitational fields equivalent to those produced by small planets. Under normal circumstances, the safety protocols surrounding these devices were absolute. The potential for catastrophic failure was simply too great to allow any kind of experimental modification. Maya began overriding those safety protocols with systematic precision. Her fingers moved across holographic interfaces with the speed and accuracy of someone who had spent months studying the station's systems. She disabled safety interlocks, rerouted power distribution networks, and began programming gravitational field modifications that would have horrified any qualified engineer. What she was creating wasn't just dangerous. It was a violation of everything that responsible beings had learned about gravitational manipulation. The first devourers reached the control center as Maya initiated the initial sequence. They flowed through the chamber's entrance like living shadows, their forms already adapting to the strange gravitational effects that were beginning to manifest around the generator columns. But they moved with caution now, having learned that this particular prey was more dangerous than anticipated. Maya stood in the center of the control chamber, her hands still moving across the interface panels, and spoke directly to the approaching creatures for the first time since the attack began. "You're not what I expected," she said conversationally, not looking up from her work. "The intelligence reports suggested you were basically mindless destroyers. Turns out you're considerably more sophisticated than that." The devourers paused, apparently surprised that she was addressing them directly. One of the larger entities shifted its form into something almost humanoid, though it retained the flowing, shadowy characteristics that marked its alien nature. "You are the source of the atmospheric contamination," it said in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Your energy signature suggests a powerless species, yet you demonstrate capabilities inconsistent with that classification." Maya smiled, continuing her work on the gravity generators. "Yeah, that's the thing about humans. We're really good at being underestimated. It served us well over the millennia. You cannot escape this installation," the devourer stated with what might have been confusion. "Your actions ensure your own destruction along with ours. This behavior pattern does not conform to any survival instinct we have encountered. That's because you've been dealing with civilizations that rely on energy-based abilities," Maya replied, activating another sequence in the gravitational modification program. "When your primary strength can be drained and turned against you, surrender becomes a rational choice. But humans learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to win is to make sure the enemy pays such a terrible price for their victory that they think twice about continuing." The gravitational fields around the control center were becoming visibly distorted now. The devourers closest to the generator columns began showing signs of structural stress as the artificial gravity created shearing forces that their shape-shifting abilities couldn't compensate for completely. More devourers poured into the chamber, surrounding Maya from all directions. But their movements were becoming increasingly erratic as the gravitational anomalies intensified. What had been fluid grace was becoming desperate struggle as the creatures found themselves fighting against forces that pulled their very molecules in different directions. "Your sacrifice accomplishes nothing," the lead devourer said, though its voice now carried undertones of what might have been concern. "We have already harvested sufficient energy from this installation to continue our expansion. Destroying a few of our number will not alter the ultimate outcome." Maya finally looked up from the control interface, meeting what passed for the creature's gaze with steady brown eyes. "Maybe not. But you're going to learn something important about humans today. We don't fight wars to win them. We fight wars to make sure our enemies remember why they shouldn't have started them in the first place." She activated the final sequence. The gravitational generators overloaded simultaneously, creating a localized space-time distortion that defied every known principle of physics. Artificial gravity fields designed to provide comfortable living conditions became chaotic maelstroms of gravitational force that twisted reality itself into impossible shapes. The devourers in the control chamber were caught completely off guard. Their shape-shifting abilities, which had allowed them to adapt to every other threat they'd encountered, became their weakness as gravitational tides pulled their forms in dozens of different directions simultaneously. They tried to merge into larger entities for stability, only to find that increased mass made them even more vulnerable to the gravitational chaos. Maya felt the forces tearing at her own body as well. Humans might not have energy-based abilities, but they were still subject to the laws of physics. The gravitational distortion was creating tidal forces that would kill any living thing caught within the field. But she'd planned for this possibility as well. Maya's hand found the emergency control that she'd installed during her weeks of preparation, a small device hidden beneath one of the control panels, connected to the station's environmental systems through modifications so subtle that they'd never been detected. She'd hoped never to use this particular contingency, but circumstances had left her no choice. The device released the last of her prepared chemical compounds directly into the control chamber's atmosphere. But this wasn't the disruption agent she'd used against the devourers throughout the station. This was something far more sophisticated. A cocktail of exotic gases that would interact with human brain chemistry in very specific ways. Maya felt her consciousness beginning to separate from her physical form as the chemicals took effect. Pain faded to distant sensation as her brain entered a state that training had taught her to recognize and exploit. She was dying, but the chemical cocktail would keep her mind clear and functional for several minutes longer than should have been possible, long enough to complete her mission. With her consciousness freed from the limitations of a pain-racked body, Maya was able to focus entirely on the gravitational control systems. She fine-tuned the space-time distortion with precision that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, creating specific resonance patterns that would propagate throughout the station's structure. The devourers in the chamber writhed in gravitational chaos that was literally tearing them apart on a molecular level. But Maya's modifications ensured that the effect wouldn't stop there. The gravitational distortion was designed to cascade through the station's artificial gravity network, creating similar anomalies throughout the structure. More importantly, the resonance patterns she was creating would interfere with the devourer's ability to harvest and process energy. The creatures depended on maintaining coherent energy fields to function, but the gravitational chaos would disrupt those fields in ways that their adaptive abilities couldn't compensate for. Through the station's sensor network, Maya watched as the effects of her sabotage spread. Devourers throughout Nexus Station began losing cohesion as the gravitational anomalies propagated through the structure. Some tried to retreat to their organic ships, only to find that the disruption field was expanding beyond the station itself. The massive devourer vessels that had seemed so invincible began showing signs of structural failure as the gravitational distortions reached them. Their organic hulls, designed to channel and process energy in specific ways, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the chaotic gravitational fields that Maya had unleashed. Maya's enhanced consciousness recorded everything through her infiltrated sensor network: the devourer's response patterns, their adaptation mechanisms, their apparent weaknesses when faced with unconventional attack methods. All of it was being transmitted in real time to the hidden monitoring devices she'd planted throughout the station. Devices that would continue broadcasting even after the station's destruction. Earth would get its intelligence. The galaxy would learn that the devourers could be fought, could be hurt, could be forced to pay a price for their aggression. And Maya Chen, the supposedly powerless maintenance worker, would have accomplished something that fleets of energy-gifted warriors had failed to achieve. As her consciousness began to fade, Maya's last coherent thought was satisfaction at how perfectly she'd played her role. Right up to the end, the devourers had underestimated her because she appeared to be exactly what she was: a young human woman with no apparent abilities or significance. They'd learned too late that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. In a universe obsessed with energy readings and power levels, Maya Chen had just reminded everyone why humanity had never needed supernatural abilities to be deadly. The gravitational cascade reached critical resonance 3 minutes and 17 seconds after Maya's death. The space-time distortion that had begun in the gravity control center propagated throughout Nexus Station and into the surrounding space, creating a localized maelstrom that tore apart everything within a sphere nearly a light minute in diameter. Station, devourers, and Maya's body all vanished in a gravitational implosion that briefly created effects visible from half the galaxy away. But the monitoring devices she'd planted continued broadcasting their data, sending the intelligence that Earth would need to survive the war that was coming. The Devourers had won the battle for Nexus Station, but at a cost they'd never experienced before. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, they'd encountered an enemy that couldn't be harvested, couldn't be turned, and couldn't be made to surrender. They'd encountered humanity. The data streams from Nexus Station's final moments reached Earth 47 hours after Maya Chen's death. Hidden monitoring devices, scattered throughout the station's debris field, continued transmitting their recorded observations even as the gravitational anomalies she'd created slowly dispersed into the cosmic background. Admiral Sarah Kim stood in the war room deep beneath New Geneva, watching the holographic displays that showed the complete destruction of humanity's most important intelligence asset. The tactical analysis was still incoming, but the broad strokes were clear enough. Nexus Station was gone, along with over 2 million beings and the Devourers' advance force. But Maya's sacrifice had given them something invaluable: proof that the enemy could be fought and damaged using methods they couldn't adapt to quickly enough to counter. The gravitational resonance cascade exceeded all projections, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the physicist responsible for analyzing Maya's improvised weapon. She didn't just destroy the station. She created a localized space-time distortion that literally tore apart the molecular bonds holding the Devourer entities together. Admiral Kim nodded grimly. At what cost? Complete annihilation of everything within a sphere approximately 12 million kilometers in diameter, Dr. Vasquez replied. The energy release was equivalent to a stellar collapse. There's nothing left but cooling plasma and gravitational echoes. The Admiral studied the tactical displays, her expression reflecting the weight of command decisions that would determine humanity's survival. Maya Chen had been one of 47 deep cover agents positioned throughout the galaxy, each trained to gather intelligence and, if necessary, to die taking as many enemies with them as possible. Now Earth's military planners knew that the sacrifice of those agents could accomplish far more than simple intelligence gathering. What's our analysis of Devourer capabilities based on the Nexus Station data? Admiral Kim asked. Colonel Martinez, the intelligence officer responsible for coordinating the deep cover program, activated a new set of displays. The recordings confirm several critical facts about the enemy. First, they're not unstoppable forces of nature. They're sophisticated energy parasites that have developed techniques for harvesting and redirecting the life force of energy-gifted species. The displays showed technical analyses of Devourer feeding patterns derived from the sensor data Maya had transmitted. Second, their shape-shifting abilities are both their greatest strength and a potential weakness. They can adapt to most forms of energy-based attack by redistributing their molecular structure, but this same flexibility makes them vulnerable to attacks that disrupt their ability to maintain coherence. And third, the Admiral prompted, third, they underestimate threats that don't fit their understanding of how conflicts should develop. They've spent eons fighting civilizations that rely on energy-based abilities. They don't know how to respond effectively to primitive but precisely applied physics. Admiral Kim absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone whose decisions would affect the survival of her species. Recommendations? We implement Protocol 7, Colonel Martinez said without hesitation. Full activation of all remaining deep cover assets. With authorization for autonomous operation, we can't coordinate their actions from Earth, but Maya proved that individual agents can cause significant damage if they're given freedom to improvise. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. Admiral, I should point out that Protocol 7 essentially authorizes our agents to develop weapons of mass destruction using whatever resources they can find. The potential for collateral damage is enormous. The potential for human extinction is also enormous, Admiral Kim replied. Colonel, send the activation codes. All agents are authorized for autonomous operation with full discretionary authority. The orders went out within the hour, transmitted through quantum-encrypted channels to human agents embedded throughout the galaxy. Each received the same message: gather intelligence, cause maximum damage to Devourer forces, and do whatever is necessary to buy Earth time to develop more comprehensive defenses. What followed was a campaign of sabotage and asymmetric warfare unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. On Kepler Station in the Vega system, maintenance worker David Park used his access to the atmospheric controls to introduce a modified virus that attacked the organic components of Devourer vessels. The creature's own adaptive abilities turned against them as the virus forced rapid mutations that made their ships uninhabitable. In the Centauri shipyards, engineer Lisa Chen triggered a cascade failure in the antimatter containment systems just as the first Devourer scouts arrived. The explosion created an artificial supernova that sterilized 3 star systems but eliminated an entire Devourer fleet in the process. On the diplomatic world of Harmony, cultural attaché Michael Santos used his position to contaminate the planet's primary water supply with compounds that interfered with energy-based life forms. When the Devourers arrived to harvest the world's energy-gifted population, they found themselves unable to process the life force they'd come to collect. Each operation was unique, tailored to local conditions and available resources by agents who'd been trained to think creatively about violence, but they all shared certain characteristics. They used the enemy's expectations against them. They exploited weaknesses that the Devourers couldn't adapt to quickly enough, and they demonstrated that humanity's lack of energy-based abilities could be turned into a strategic advantage. The Devourers found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't behave according to any patterns they understood. Humans didn't surrender when overwhelmed. They didn't attempt to negotiate when faced with superior force. Instead, they turned themselves into weapons, using physics and chemistry and pure determination to inflict damage that energy-based civilizations would never have considered possible. But the campaign came at a terrible price. Of the 47 agents activated under Protocol 7, only 12 survived their missions. The others died in explosions that eliminated devourer forces, in chemical reactions that poisoned entire star systems, or in gravitational anomalies that rewrote local space-time. Each death was recorded, analyzed, and incorporated into Earth's growing understanding of how to fight an enemy that had never encountered anything like humanity's approach to warfare. The intelligence gathered during these suicide missions revealed patterns in devourer behavior that allowed Earth strategists to develop more comprehensive defense plans. The creatures were methodical in their expansion, always following energy signatures toward the most powerful concentrations of life force. They relied on their ability to corrupt and redirect enemy capabilities, turning strength into weakness through biological and energy manipulation. But they struggled against opponents who used purely physical methods of attack: chemical weapons, kinetic bombardment, gravitational manipulation, nuclear explosions. All of these proved effective against devourer forces because they operated according to principles the creatures couldn't easily adapt to or redirect. More importantly, the human agents had demonstrated something that no other species in the galaxy had managed. They could force the devourers to pay a significant price for their victories. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, the ancient enemy was experiencing losses that made them reconsider their tactical approaches. The breakthrough came 6 months after Maya Chen's death at Nexus Station. Dr. Elena Vasquez, working with data from all 47 agent operations, identified the crucial weakness that could be exploited on a strategic scale. The devourers aren't just energy parasites, she explained to Admiral Kim in the assembled War Council. They're energy addicts. Their entire biological and technological infrastructure depends on a constant influx of harvested life force. When that supply is interrupted or contaminated, their ability to maintain cohesion breaks down rapidly. The tactical implications were staggering. Earth didn't need to develop weapons capable of destroying devourer forces directly. They needed to develop methods for disrupting the enemy's ability to harvest and process energy from their victims. We can't match their firepower or their adaptive capabilities, Dr. Vasquez continued. But we can poison their food supply. Every world they try to harvest, every energy-gifted species they encounter, becomes a potential weapon against them if we can introduce the right disruption agents into the local environment. Admiral Kim leaned back in her chair, seeing the shape of Earth's strategy beginning to emerge. You're talking about turning the entire galaxy into a trap. Exactly. The Devourer's greatest strength is their ability to feed on the energy-based abilities that every other civilization depends on. But that same dependency becomes a critical vulnerability if we can make those abilities toxic to them. The plan that emerged from Dr. Vasquez's research was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Earth would deploy teams of human agents throughout the galaxy, not as suicide bombers but as long-term saboteurs. Their mission would be to introduce carefully designed chemical and biological agents into the environments of energy-gifted civilizations. These agents wouldn't harm the local populations directly, but they would alter the fundamental nature of the life force that the Devourers sought to harvest. When the ancient enemy arrived to feed, they would find themselves consuming poison instead of sustenance. The operation required unprecedented coordination between Earth's military and scientific establishments. Thousands of specialized compounds had to be synthesized, each designed to interact with different types of energy-based life forms. Transportation networks had to be established to move agents and equipment across vast interstellar distances. Most importantly, Earth had to develop methods for communicating with galactic civilizations that had never taken humanity seriously. Maya Chen's sacrifice at Nexus Station became the foundation of this diplomatic effort. The recordings of her final battle, showing a powerless human-destroying forces that had consumed dozens of star systems, proved that humanity possessed capabilities that the galaxy's energy-gifted species desperately needed. For the first time in galactic history, beings who had considered humans to be barely above livestock found themselves asking for help from the species they'd ignored and dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on Admiral Kim as she received increasingly desperate requests for assistance from civilizations that were discovering their energy-based abilities made them primary targets for the Devourer expansion. They want to know how our powerless agents can accomplish what their most advanced warriors cannot. Colonel Martinez reported during one of the daily briefings. The Corvani hegemony is offering to transfer military technology in exchange for training in human combat techniques. The Ethereal Collective wants to establish joint research programs to develop non-energy-based weapons. Admiral Kim smiled grimly. Tell them we're willing to discuss cooperation, but on our terms. Every agreement includes clauses that guarantee human equality in any post-war governmental structures. No more second-class citizenship. No more assignments to maintenance duties based on energy readings. The war against the Devourers continued for 3 more years, but it became a very different conflict than anyone had anticipated. Instead of the swift conquest that the ancient enemy had experienced throughout their expansion, they found themselves fighting a galaxy-wide insurgency that turned their own feeding mechanisms against them. Human agents, working with local populations that had learned to value their expertise, established networks of resistance that operated according to principles the Devourers couldn't counter effectively. They used chemistry instead of energy manipulation. They employed kinetic weapons instead of particle beams. They relied on coordination and planning instead of individual power levels. Most importantly, they remembered Maya Chen and the lesson she'd taught at Nexus Station. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with a gradual recognition that the Devourers' expansion had been permanently halted. Faced with a galaxy that had learned to make itself toxic to their feeding mechanisms, the ancient enemy retreated to the galactic core and disappeared back into the darkness between the stars. Humanity emerged from the conflict as the galaxy's newest major power. Their lack of energy-based abilities transformed from a liability into the foundation of their influence. Maya Chen, the supposedly powerless maintenance worker who had started it all, became the symbol of humanity's rise from irrelevance to galactic leadership. In the war memorial constructed at the site where Nexus Station had once orbited, her name was inscribed alongside those of the other 46 agents who had given their lives to prove that power wasn't measured by energy readings or supernatural abilities. Sometimes, the most dangerous being in the universe is the one who knows exactly how powerless they appear to be, and uses that knowledge to remind everyone else that there are many different ways to fight and many different ways to win.